After spending nearly 3 decades on death row, Antonio Sanchez Franklin's name reappeared on Ohio's execution calendar. His date, February 11, 2026. 4 years, the state had not carried out a single execution, but Franklin's case was marked in red as one of the first to return. He had been only 18 when he carried out an act of violence so shocking it left Dayton, Ohio, in disbelief. 3 of his own family members murdered inside their home before he tried to erase the crime in fire and silence. This is the story of a young man, an ultimatum, and the night blood and flames consumed an entire house on Regal Street. Welcome to True Crime Archive. Dayton, Ohio. April 18, 1997. The neighborhood around Regal Street was still, its windows dark, its houses silent. The Franklin family lived in a modest 2-story home, the kind of house that looked ordinary, quiet, safe. Inside, 3 people slept peacefully. Ivory Franklin, 76, a man who had worked his entire life and was looking toward his twilight years in peace. Oilia Franklin, 71, his wife, known by neighbors for her soft voice and kind spirit. And their son, Anthony Franklin, 38, who still lived at home with them. It was the home of a family that had weathered storms together, but also carried unspoken tensions. Also part of the household was their grandson, 18-year-old Antonio Sanchez Franklin. But on this night, he wasn't home. Antonio had left the house hours earlier. What no one knew was that he would return before dawn, carrying a baseball bat, gasoline, and rage that had been simmering for months. To understand the crime, you must first understand the man. Antonio had been raised by his grandparents since childhood, after his mother left him in their care. His relationship with his uncle Anthony was complicated. Antonio later alleged that his uncle had abused him when he was just 14, though no official report was ever made. He was a withdrawn teenager, quiet, sullen, keeping to himself. He dropped out of school. He didn't work. His days were spent mostly indoors, staring at walls, or wandering the neighborhood aimlessly. But inside the Franklin home, patience was wearing thin. His grandparents wanted him to change, to build a future. They gave him an ultimatum: 30 days to get a job or go back to school. Otherwise, he would have to leave. For most, this would be a push toward independence. For Antonio, it felt like rejection, like abandonment all over again. A door closing forever. It was still dark when Antonio returned. He slipped inside silently. The house was quiet, everyone asleep. In his hands, a baseball bat. First, he crept into his grandfather's room. Ivory never woke. The blows came fast, heavy, relentless. By the time it stopped, the elderly man had no chance of survival. Then came Oilia, his grandmother. She awoke in confusion, perhaps even calling out his name. Antonio struck her too, blow after blow, until he finally pulled out a gun and fired a single shot into her head. She died instantly. Anthony, his uncle, tried to escape. He may have stumbled through the hallway, desperate to get away. But Antonio caught him. The bat came down again and again. His body was left unrecognizable. 3 lives ended in brutal silence. But Antonio wasn't done. He poured fuel around the house and lit the match. Flames crawled across floors, devouring photographs, furniture, and memories. Before leaving, he stole family heirlooms, a firearm, and his grandfather's car. Then, without looking back, he drove away. At 1:53 a.m., the 911 call came in. Smoke, fire, flames pouring from the Franklin home. Firefighters rushed to Regal Street, but when they forced entry, they found more than fire. The bodies of Ivory and Oilia were discovered first. The burns were severe, but the blunt force injuries told the real story. Hours later, as flames died down, they found Anthony. Investigators worked the charred ruins for hours. Traces of gasoline confirmed arson. Missing valuables pointed to theft. One detail stood out: Antonio was nowhere to be found. Within days, police tracked him to Tennessee. He was arrested alone, driving his grandfather's stolen car. During questioning, Antonio admitted resentment had been building for years. He spoke of his uncle's past abuse, of feeling abandoned by his mother, of clashing with his grandparents over his future. But the brutal nature of the murders, the beatings, the gunshot, the fire, spoke of something deeper than resentment. Investigators described it as calculated rage. Not a momentary outburst. A decision. The trial opened in mid-1998, nearly a year later. Dayton followed every headline. The courtroom was packed. Family members filled the benches. Reporters scribbled notes. The prosecution laid out their case: 3 murders, aggravated robbery, aggravated arson, firearms specifications. 15 charges in total. Forensic experts described the wounds. Fire investigators explained how gasoline had been poured. Police testified about the arrest. The defense pushed a different story. They presented Antonio as a young man scarred by trauma, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder. They argued he was mentally unstable, not fully in control. But throughout the trial, Franklin barely reacted. He sat stone-faced, staring upward, rarely speaking. No tears. No pleas. Just silence. When the jury retired to deliberate, it took little time. They returned unanimous, guilty on all counts. The sentence: death. 3 times over. Plus 91 years for the remaining charges. During the sentencing hearing, emotions spilled over. One relative read a poem for the victims. Some cried. Some demanded justice. Others whispered forgiveness. Antonio remained silent. In 1998, Antonio was sent to the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, a place known simply as Death Row. Life there is monotonous. A small cell, limited contact, controlled movements. For nearly 30 years, Antonio lived in that rhythm. He caused no incidents. Guards described him as quiet, disciplined. He spoke to no media, wrote no letters. He never sought attention. He simply waited year after year, as appeals worked their way through the courts. His lawyers fought tirelessly, arguing trauma and mental illness, but one by one, appeals were denied. The Ohio Supreme Court upheld his sentence. Federal courts found no errors. By 2023, his execution was postponed only because the state struggled to obtain the drugs for lethal injection. For years, Ohio carried out no executions. But eventually, the calendar was reset. and Franklin's name was written in red. On February 11, 2026, Antonio Sanchez Franklin is scheduled to die by lethal injection at the same prison where he has spent his adult life. Witnesses may include officials, media, and family of the victims. No one knows if anyone will come on his behalf. Unlike other cases that spark controversy or campaigns, Franklin's execution has been quiet. No protests, no petitions, just a date, a chamber, and silence. This case raises a haunting question. 3 people died in fire and blood, and justice demanded death. But when nearly 3 decades pass between crime and punishment, what does justice become? For some, it's closure. For others, it's hollow. A punishment stretched so long it feels like another kind of suffering. Antonio lived nearly 30 years in silence. His victims lost their lives in minutes. Which fate is heavier? Which is justice? On Regal Street, the house is long gone. But the memory of that night, of fire, of betrayal, of family destroyed from within, remains. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more crime stories on True Crime Archives.